san Ira Cláir, agus our son, agus our son Harry Hughes nach féidir leis a bhain seo gur an fáilte roimh. Tonight's event is just a commemorative event that we had planned for last year, but obviously because of COVID had to defer. So we're very grateful to Clare County Council for funding for this under the Decade of Centenaries programme. And our project for which we got funding was this lecture is the centrepiece by Dr. Phádraig Ruairc and chaired by Michael Hennessy, who's particular associations with one of the events. But also we hope to make a video record of the houses, 8 houses in Milltown that were attacked and burned by way of reprisal in 1920 and 1921, just for the future generation to have as a historical record. And the third element is we hope to we are involving the school children from the local national schools in a project to see how much of memory of those times still survives in the community, just perhaps even to compare it with the 1937-38 National Folklore Collection in the schools. So we'll be planning to implement that in the weeks ahead. And tonight's lecture, as you can see, is being videoed, and we'll have that video plus the video of the houses up on our website as soon as we can thereafter, so that everybody can, even those who can't be here tonight, can see it. So I'd want to thank especially Michael Hennessy, whose grandfather was one of the Canada Cross 3 victims, for agreeing to chair tonight's event because of the special associations and the link it represents, I suppose, to that great generation of men and women to whom we owe so much for our present situation. So, Mike, over to you.
Thanks very much. Thank you, Seamus. Thank you very much for that. And you're all welcome to our splendid community hall here for this. And there is a press release which will give you an outline of the subjects and how Phádraig is going to cover them. It's presented, and we are very grateful to them, by Phádraig or OaC for easy going. And the subject is the War of Independence, events in Milltown, Malbay and District 1920-1921. And it'll be given, as I said, by Dr. Phádraig O'Rourke. During the talk, he will cover key events such as the Canada Cross Massacre, the Renine Ambush, the murder of Charles Lynch, the assassination of Constable Stanley Moore, and the IRA's execution and, in brackets, disappearance of 2 British soldiers from the Royal Scots Regiment. And just by way of introduction, Dr. Phádraig is a native of Meelick, County Clare, just about the other side of the county. But he has, as most of us probably know, very strong associations with Milltown, with his dad in particular coming from there and grandparents. And he has a PhD in history, and he has published many books. In particular, the books to do with the Irish Revolution, covering a period from 1913 to 1923. And he's one of the books that we all, I think, know about is Blood on the Banner, the Republican Struggle in Clare. And as well as that, he's a regular contributor to various media, to radio and RT and so on. So at the end of the lecture, by the way, Phádraig will invite questions from anyone who might like to ask anything, and he will cover them. And over to you now, Phádraig.
Thanks very much. Míle maith agus míle maith go léir as up chat agus míle maith don Aidreacht an Clár as up don Cuid. Great to be back in front of a live vaccinated audience. And I took the antigen test this morning, so you should all be safe, but keep the masks on anyway. I was actually, it's been very strange, obviously, for all of us in lockdown, but I was delighted because I was booked as part of the Willie Clancy Music Festival to give a talk and even to sing a song. in a presentation about the songs of the War of Independence in Clare and in Ireland. But of course, that ended up being an online event. And no, I'm not going to sing tonight. That's still verboten under the COVID rules. Anyway, so what I'm going to talk about tonight is an overview of the War of Independence in Milltown Malbay and surrounding district. I've highlighted the word overview because I'm not going to cover every single incident. I hope to only speak for about 45 minutes, and we'll take questions. And there will, of course, be, given that you're locals, there will, of course, be things I miss. There will be things that you'll have more detail on, and these are always interesting learning experiences for me too. So, what I'm going to cover in the talk is the Canada Cross Massacre of April 1920, the IRA assassination of Constable Moore, the execution of Private George Robertson, sorry, that's in the wrong order, the Renine ambush, the murder of Charles Lynch, which leads to the execution of Private George Robertson, the execution of George Duff Chalmers, who's another British soldier, the death of IRA Captain Christy McCarthy. Now, all the other events I talk about happen in kind of the Milltown Malbay area. Christy McCarthy was a man from Cuid, and of course I'm sure you'll all be familiar with McCarthy's pub, but he died in my home place of Léacht in South East Clare. So what we have here, and of course we'll have time for questions at the end as well, and what we have here is a map of kind of the main actions, the main IRA attacks in County Clare at the time. You can see there's 3 different brigade areas, West Clare down here. You have the Mid Clare Brigade area, which Milltown Malbay and the 4th Battalion, which is mainly what I'll be talking about. We often think of Milltown Malbay as being West Clare, but for IRA organisational purposes in 1920-21, it was part of the Mid Clare Brigade, and then East Clare further over, that's Michael Brennan's territory. And again, East Clare and the Mid Clare Brigade would have been the most active areas. West Clare, less so, but still some very important events did happen there. So the first thing to talk about, the Canada Cross Massacre, April of 1920. This is Canada Cross, of course, today. Hands up, who knows why it's called Canada Cross? Man in the front row, go on.
That's where the coach used to leave to go up to during the emigrations, is that right?
That's one theory. I heard a different version. Anyone else why it's called Canada Cross? The reason I heard, and again you can correct me if I'm wrong, is that the local Fenians used to meet there, and it was the first place that word got out in County Clare about the Fenian invasion of Canada. Ever hear of that? The Irish invaded Canada twice, 1865 and 1867. First time that the title IRA, Irish Republican Army, was ever used. So sometimes people talk about the War of Independence as being the old IRA. This is the old IRA. By the way, as well, who's ever read the Fenian Proclamation of 1867? Hands up. Way, way better than the 1916 Proclamation. Not going to go into it now. I have a video on YouTube about it. So coming back to the Canada Cross, we're talking about 1920. What happens is there are a lot of Claremen and Irishmen in prison for political reasons in the spring and early summer of 1920. And the reason why they are locked up is for political activity. Basically for taking part in a parade, for having a tricolour flag, for singing a seditious song, for speaking the Irish language, or of course for being involved with the Sinn Féin party of that time, or with the IRA. You could be locked up. And in fact, there had been in a slightly earlier period a policy of we'll all line up on Sunday and we'll march through the town. The Royal Irish Constabulary, Britain's colonial police force in Ireland, would make a note of who was there. These men would be arrested. They'd all go on hunger strike. There'd be big drama about it. They'd be released. And basically it was a way of building up support and defying the British authorities. So there was a massive hunger strike in Mountjoy in April of 1920. This is a photograph of some of those who were involved. Someone who's not pictured in it, I think, is Phádraig Clancy, who had led a hunger strike in Mountjoy at the time. He, of course, was a West Clare man. And Clancy's hunger strike and the Mountjoy hunger strike was brilliant, because normally what people would hunger strike for, and again this is something that had been used by the suffragettes in earlier years and later picked up by Irish Republicans, what they would normally hunger strike for was demand, prisoner of war status, the right to wear their own clothes instead of convict clothes or whatever. The Mountjoy hunger strike is so successful, and the labour movement at the time rolls in behind it, and they organised this big national strike. Not only did they get the right to wear their own clothes and cave in, as soon as they're granted that, Phádraig Clancy and the leaders of the hunger strike say, no, we're not coming off this hunger strike until you release us all. And the British government basically panics. They don't want another martyr like Thomas Ashe, who had died on hunger strike, so they all get released. This, of course, is a very big event, and it's celebrated at Canada Cross. And this is an eyewitness account from Ned Lynch, who was a captain of a local IRA company. And he said, a crowd was singing and celebrating, mostly Sinn Féin supporters. I was on the run at the time and was watching proceedings about 100 yards away at, I think it's Canuckin's shoe shop. 8 armed soldiers left the RIC post with Sergeant Hampson headed for the crowd. With revolvers drawn and soldiers bearing arms, they called on the crowd to disperse and opened fire. Volunteer John O'Loughlin fell fatally wounded in the stampede beside a blazing tar barrel. Myself and the local blacksmith, Pat Maguire, rushed to O'Loughlin's aid and took him to Canuckin's. Thomas O'Leary and Patrick Hennessy were killed and 7 wounded. And thanks very much to, I think, Cyril Jones actually brought along, I'm not sure they're from Renine or from Canada's Cross, but sections of the furniture that had been shot up at the time. We might hear about that afterwards. What happens in the wake of the Canada Cross? Well, what normally happens in the wake of a British massacre, there's a cover-up. There's a coroner's inquest, and the British soldiers from the Royal Highland Light Infantry come in, and they say that, the crowd fired on us, so we defended ourselves, we returned fire, and that's how these men were killed. And almost every member of the RIC who was stationed in Milltown, when they are brought up, say the same thing. Yeah, we marched down and the crowd were violent, they threw stones, they fired shots at us, so we were defending ourselves and restoring law and order. Except for one guy, one decent, we heard a lot in the RIC commemoration about the decent RIC men. Here's a decent RIC man, Constable MacDonald, who stated that the crowd weren't violent and all the other members of the RIC who got on the stand before him were lying and committing perjury. If you want to commemorate an RIC man, there's one we should be remembering. So locals, the local account was they swore that the RIC Sergeant Hampson was drunk and that he had told the RIC and the British soldiers to get ready beforehand. You get the impression they were all liquored up for this. Another RIC constable was heard saying that it was all right to kill Sinn Féiners. Sergeant Hampson was the first to open fire at 8 yards, killing 1 man. Dr. Hillary showed that, of course, famous local family, showed that 2 of the dead men had been shot in the back. RIC Sergeant Hampson, Constables O'Connor and Keenan were found guilty of willful murder without provocation. 6 British soldiers were also found guilty of murder. And what happened to them? How did the British respond? Well, they banned the inquests and the court cases. You've heard the song Rule Britannia. Britannia waves the rules. And of course, this isn't anything like what Theresa May and Boris Johnson are doing today involving court cases with British soldiers. But what happened was basically a jury in Cork had just returned a verdict the previous month that Tomás McCurtain, the mayor, had been assassinated by the Royal Irish Constabulary. And then you have another jury in Clare saying that the British Army and the RIC are guilty of murder. So the British solution is, right, no more inquests. None done by civilians anyway. The British Army would take care of it from there. And this is the grave, I think, or the memorial for John O'Loughlin, Thomas O'Leary and Patrick Hennessy. You can see a very nice inscription there. An Cross Léacht Seo I Gwimna or Truair, Phádraig ó Héngasa, Tomás O'Leary agus Sean O'Loughlin, Truair Far Ciún Machanta, a Marav Arm na Sasna, gan Cúis, gan Aber, gan Truaig. 3 thoughtful, quiet men murdered by or killed by the English army. In this case, it says, interesting though, they were Scottish men in the British army. Gan Cúis without reason, gan Truaig without mercy. And who were the three men? Just a brief overview, and again, I'm open to correction on this. This is the Clare senior football team. They were All-Ireland finalists in 1917. Paddy Hennessy is the middle row. I think this is him, third from the left. Patrick Hennessy, 30-year-old IRA volunteer, I think. Farmer, married with 2 children. Thomas O'Leary, 38 years old, an ex-British soldier, but again, not uncommon for ex-British soldiers to be supporting Republicans in this period. He was married with 10 children. And John O'Loughlin, 28 years old, IRA volunteer and a tailor. And again, if I have any of the biographical details wrong, I apologise and I'm open to correction. Currently, of course, there's a wonderful, beautiful piece of art. I had a look at it when I actually parked down there. Personally, I'd have prioritised the 3 men who were killed over 3 men who went to prison. But the first thing I asked on arriving in Milltown is there a plaque coming to commemorate it? And I've been told there is, which is great news. So we'll watch that space. The Renine ambush. Now, we could give 3 or 4 lectures on different aspects of the Renine ambush. I don't have time to go into it in extraordinary detail here. Again, this is just going to be an overview. I did have, you might have heard it during COVID, a documentary on Clare FM which explored the ambush and some of the reprisals which followed it in more detail. I think that's still available free online if any of you haven't heard it. Before talking about Renine, we have to, of course, mention what happened that morning. This is Captain Alan Kane Lendrum. Essentially, he was killed at, I think it's Craigenach. There was a carjacking. The IRA wanted his vehicle. He seems to have resisted. Whatever happened, he was shot dead by the IRA. Now, a lot of people have gotten this story wrong over the years, myself included. I've gotten elements of it wrong, but I never engaged in the propaganda myth that he was deliberately tortured or drowned. You might have heard this one, that Lendrum was taken by his captors, buried up to his neck in the sand, and he watches the low tide come in. And then, of course, some accounts of this are even more gruesome, that the IRA, of course, these feckless Irishmen are so stupid, they haven't buried him low enough down and they have to do it a second time. That tale is total fiction. It starts out in 1922 in a book called Tales of the RIC, which is a propaganda book, probably written by Basil Clarke. Then it appears in these other publications, Richard Bennett, Rex Taylor, who says it's the most savage atrocity in the history of Ireland, and then Kevin Myers, remember him, he used it in the Irishman's Diary, and then more recently Richard Abbott, who's an ex-RUC officer, had it in his 2000 book, Police Casualties in Ireland. Though, in fairness, I think he corrected his errors later. And if anyone is interested in that particular case, have you all got this book? It's not my book, Owen Shanahan's The Hand That Held the Gun. Excellent on the Renine reprisals and excellent on, he's the man who really has set the story straight about Captain Lendrum. What happens anyway on the morning of the Renine ambush is that an RAC Crossley tender, much like this one, was travelling between Ennistimon and Milltown, Malbay. Okay, I think I have that right. This Crossley tender is actually in Kilrush, and the guy who's driving it is a black and tan from Tasmania. All right. So the black and tans often were used as drivers because they had more motoring experience than the RIC, and then these are probably regular RIC constables in back. And that's the exact setup that happens in at the Renine. The ambush site is prepared. Ignatius O'Neill, of course, is the local IRA leader. The lorry goes through, you all know the story, through the ambush, reaches Milltown. Something goes wrong in the preparation of the ambush. Some people say the lorry, or the word police car coming, is misunderstood as 3 cars coming, and they say we're only here to ambush one, and there's all this confusion. There's various versions of it, but whatever happens, this is what the ambush site looked like on the day. You can see some of the positions. The car here returning from Milltown, Malbay, and all 6 members of the patrol are killed. You'll hear very vivid descriptions of this happened at Renine and that happened at Renine. If you read the accounts of the men who were there, who took part in the fighting, most of them tend to agree that, it was 40 to 60 seconds. It was about 1 minute. 2 of the RIC men did jump out the back of the lorry and did attempt to escape. One of them was chased down and shot. The other one was shot as he leapt from the lorry. It was at that stage the largest and most successful ambush in the War of Independence. Prior to this, the largest ambush that had happened was the shooting of 3 RIC constables in Timoleague. So this is twice the size. And as far as I can work out, it's the first time that a very large, even though they're not a flying column, but that an IRA group this large had actually assembled to take part in an ambush. The British, of course, alleged that the IRA massacred the RIC. And this is something that comes up again with Kilmichael. And they say that the IRA used dum-dum bullets. These were an illegal type of expanding ammunition. Well, we do know that one of the locals who was killed afterwards was shot with an expanding dum-dum bullet, but he was shot by the British Crown Forces. The IRA may have used this illegal ammunition, but let's not forget, where did the IRA get their weapons from? They stole them from the British and reused them. And as to the question that the IRA, you'll hear accounts saying, oh, did they capture them and murder them or put them to death? The British record of the Black and Tan who's killed in the ambush, he was from London, I think, a Constable Hardman. It actually just says killed in ambush. It doesn't use the usual murdered by Sinn Féin line that the RIC often used. 4 RIC, as I said, are killed in the fire, and one civilian, John Keane, is shot by the British afterwards. He's the guy who shot with the dum-dum round. Reprisals, of course, follow the Rineen ambush. The shooting of John Keane isn't enough to sate the British forces' appetite for revenge. What happens, of course, in the aftermath of the ambush is the British soldiers who had been out, they didn't know about the ambush, but they had been out searching for Captain Lendrum, came across the lorry on the road, came across the IRA guys who were taking their time about leaving the location, and they actually opened fire on them. And of course, there's a great running battle. The IRA get away with, I think, 2 to 3 men wounded, including the commander, Ignatius O'Neill. And the reprisals that follow are largely not the work of the Black and Tans or the RIC. They're there, they're pointing out houses. But the people who go in and who burn the houses or take the people inside out and kill them are, I think in almost all cases, members of the British Army and the Royal Scots Regiment, these guys here. It's very convenient for people later to say, oh, the Black and Tans did it, but, and pretend that this disciplined British Army force wasn't involved. The Rineen reprisals, of course, aren't just here in Milltown Malbay. They're spread across 4 towns, Milltown Malbay, Lahinch, Liscannor and Ennistimon. You have, I think it's actually 6 civilians, I should update that, and 1 IRA volunteer killed. I have an error there, actually. I say it's a 15-year-old boy. He's not, he's 21. We'll come to him in a minute. 70 houses and businesses are destroyed, including property owned by loyalists. In some cases, the British forces, particularly in Ennistimon, were so drunk they didn't know whose house they were burning. They were just torching everything in the street. The total of 70 houses I have comes from the RIC records. And think about it. If the British Army and the police arrive and they burn down your house, are you going to go to the police station and report it? No. So it's probably more than 70 houses were destroyed. A British soldier and a Black and Tan are charged with rape in the aftermath of this. And during the reprisals, members of the British forces shout, "Remember Balbriggan." Now, Balbriggan was the burning of a suburb, well, it wasn't a suburb at the time, but a village in Dublin that had happened 2 days before. News of that is just getting out when the British engage in their reprisals. And basically, they're celebrating the fact that they are doing a Balbriggan. Remember Balbriggan. The RIC reports at the time claimed that their first British account of this is that it's an anti-Sinn Féin gang, that it's locals who are opposed to Sinn Féin, secret local loyalists, come in and carry out all this wave of murder and arson, which of course is total nonsense, because Hammer Greenwood, who's the, I think, Chief Secretary of Ireland, later comes out in the House of Commons and goes, well, actually it was our troops that did it, but they had been driven mad by seeing their comrades murdered. Of course, again, Jones' shop is one of the places burnt, and that's a plaque that was put up recently. Tom Knoll, just to go through some of the victims, Tom Knoll was a trade union organiser. He's often described as an IRA volunteer. He wasn't. It's worth emphasising that the Labour movement and the Republican movement were very close at the time, but he was not, as far as we can work out, an IRA volunteer. He was murdered by British soldiers from the Royal Scots Regiment, took him out of the house. The British often viewed Labour organisers with suspicion, rightly so from their point of view. They executed him in front of his wife and infant children, and then they threw his body back into the house where it was consumed by the flames. You can see the image of that here, and that's the monument to him in Ennistimon today. I think it's pronounced Paig. Is it Lehan or Lehan you say up here? Lehan? Okay, member of an IRA. He was a participant in the ambush, and that's him. That's a plaque at the building where he was burned. And again, there's different accounts of, some people say he was hiding in the building in the attic and it was set on fire and he couldn't escape. Some of his family had a pension application in, and they say he was actually captured, executed and thrown into the fire. Again, there's two different versions by people who were alive at the time, so it's hard to know. Píle J. Lenan, 21 years old. He's often described as being 15. He's often described as being a member of Fianna Éireann, the Republican Boy Scouts. He wasn't, he was a civilian. And that is marking the spot where he was killed. And again, I think he was killed by British soldiers, not Black and Tans. And the others killed by the Royal Scots are Sean Keane, he's the farmer at the ambush site. Joseph Salmon, who's a civilian from East Clare. He's shot, he's on holidays in Ennistimon. Dan Lehan is the father of Paig, we just talked about. He is shot in the Lahinch district, not in the town itself. And someone who's very often forgotten, Nora Fox, who's an 8-year-old girl killed in Lahinch. She isn't actually shot by the Royal Scots, but they arrive, they burn down her family's home, and as she's fleeing with her parents, she falls and suffers a fatal head injury. And again, she wouldn't have been running if British soldiers weren't burning down her home while the police stood by and watched. The Catholic Church's attitude to this is very interesting, and I think it's very interesting that you have things like the current debate about the commemoration of Northern Ireland and partition. Who's organising that? You know, it's the Catholic Archbishop of Armagh, the Protestant Archbishop of Armagh. The Catholic Church at the time are very, very, very pro-British and anti-Republican. It's not unusual in the history of the Catholic Church in Ireland, and here's an example of it. Father Enright, who was the parish priest of Milltown Malbay, in 1920, when he condemned what had happened after Renine, he did not condemn the British Crown Forces. His focus was on the IRA. Here's a direct quote from him. "It is folly to make an attempt to overthrow the power of the British government. The murder of a few policemen," note that word, murder, "by the IRA will not overthrow the power of His Majesty King George's government, and it is absolute insanity to think so." Kilrush outrage. I mentioned it briefly at the start. It happens just after the Renine ambush, but I think it's worth including. It may be related to the general violence that happened at the time. The RIC report that there is an indecent assault of a woman called Kathleen Kelly at Kilrush by a Black and Tan and British soldier. When they say an assault, what they mean is an attempted rape or a gang rape. The British soldier is acquitted of rape and released. The Black and Tan involved, Constable Huddleston, and again, he's an Irishman, not all the Black and Tans were English, is found guilty. The convicted rapist, Constable James V. Huddleston, was an Irish Black and Tan, a Protestant from Leitrim. He was an ex-British Marine from the First World War. Again, plenty of Clare men actually joined the Black and Tans, and Protestant here isn't that significant because I think it was 69 Clare men joined the Tans and the Auxies. Well over 50 of them were Catholic ex-soldiers. Anyway, this guy Huddleston was sentenced to jail with hard labour for rape. Moving on from Renine, the next big event that happens in Milltown, I'm going to jump up to this event. The next event chronologically will be the shooting of Charles Lynch, but I'm just going to move up to this one because the Lynch story is a bit more complicated and tied to other ones. In March of 1921, an RIC constable is assassinated in Milltown, RIC Constable Stanley Moore. Now, on that night, the Mid-Clare Brigade of the IRA had a plan that they would simultaneously hit RIC men throughout the North and Mid-Clare Brigade area. And the idea was that it was pay night for the RIC, they'd be out, they'd have a few drinks on them, and it would be a good night to have this coordinated operation. And if all these attacks came off, it would be a spectacular, it would be a real IRA show of strength. As far as I can work out, there was only one other attempted action on the night this happens. This is arranged, and that was an attempt to ambush a group of RIC and Black and Tans at Lisdoonvarna, but word of it gets back to the local British forces and they don't come out at the night. What happens here in Milltown Malbay is described by John Jones, and he was, I think, a battalion intelligence officer with the IRA. He was involved in planning the attack. He says, I met the attacking party on the Ballard Road about 9 o'clock and led them into the town through Hills Lane into the ruins of O'Neill's old home, which had been burned as a reprisal for the Rineen ambush. We took up positions waiting for the Tans to leave Wilson's pub, and I arranged with the party to withhold their fire until the Tans had left Wilson's and were passing a demolished house owned by the Roach family. At 9:30, the Tans came to the door, accompanied by Mr. Wilson, where they remained in conversation for a few minutes and then moved off. No sooner had they done so than someone in our party fired. So somebody is nervous or they have a light trigger on their gun and they shoot early. This started a fusillade from the guns of the others. Both Tans fell, so it was 2 Black and Tans, and were presumed dead. But it later transpired that only one Constable Moore was killed. And who was Moore? Moore was a 31-year-old single man from Glamorgan in Scotland who'd been a dentist and a soldier before joining the RIC as a Black and Tan. So going back now to the proper chronology of things, after the Rineen ambush comes the murder of Charles Lynch at Breafen North in near Milltown. So this is Lynch. He is a farmer in his 70s, and he is not involved in Republican politics, but a number of his sons are. And what happens is British soldiers from the Royal Scots Regiment, 2 of them in particular, a Private Norman Buchanan and a Lance Corporal Alexander McPherson, are drinking in all the pubs in Milltown. And in one of the pubs, they steal a toy gun known as the Shot of Malt. Somebody's actually, I think again it may be Cyril Jones or someone has brought along a replica of one here. It was this kind of novelty drinking glass that looked like a gun and you could have your whiskey in it. They had stolen one of these from the pubs, these 2 British soldiers. They had painted it black so it looked like a gun in the dark, or if somebody had it in their pocket or just showed it for a second. And they were going around robbing people in Milltown and then made their way out to Breafen North, where they robbed a number of houses before coming to Lynch's. Lynch's was the wrong house to rob because Charles Lynch's sons, one of them Ned Lynch, was in the IRA. The sons were home at the time doing farm work, and basically they beat up these British soldiers, they smashed the glass gun they had, and they managed, I think they searched them for money that had been stolen from some of the neighbours. The British soldiers, of course, ran off, cursing and swearing and saying that they'd be back. Obviously, what happens is that when they do return, they have a much larger force with them. And Lance Corporal McPherson opens fire and he shoots dead Charles Lynch, who, as I said, was an inoffensive old farmer. What happened was the British again have their own inquiry, and of course this time they're not going to let civilians and the judge and the coroner decide what happens. It's all British Army soldiers and officers who make up the inquiry. And the first story that comes out that these British soldiers, Buchanan and McPherson, come up with is that they claimed they had been shot at, and again they were acting in self-defense, and they have these really vivid imaginative accounts of guys jumping at them with pitchforks and they fight them all off, this kind of stuff. But later, when questions keep being asked in Parliament about this, eventually they come out and said, oh yeah, actually we did shoot him, but it was an accidental shooting. So the British again changed their story on it. What happens is that McPherson, as I said, we've gone through that, that they're basically beaten up by Ned Lynch and his brothers. Macpherson is in trouble with the British either because he had been out drinking or he was being held in relation to, the sham inquiry that was going to take place into this incident. And what happens is he's being held supposedly as a prisoner in Milltown Malbay, and the next thing he absconds, he disappears from the British barracks. And he takes with him a second British soldier called Private George Robertson. Now, Robertson, as far as I can work out, had not been involved in the shooting of Lynch. It was just Macpherson. The two of them head out into, they're walking along the railway line towards the Connolly district, and they are spotted by a local IRA volunteer who, thinking very quickly, grabs a pipe, puts it into his pocket, or he grabs the tap off a barrel, and he basically holds them up in the dark. The IRA volunteers who arrest these guys don't have any guns. They're taken to the local IRA company, and the local IRA officers basically say, "Who are you? What are you doing here?" And they say, "We're deserters. We're fed up with British Army life, and we want to get back home to Scotland." So the IRA initially take them as genuine deserters, and these guys are actually taken to a local Cayley, and they're held in local IRA safe houses for a night or two. Meanwhile, they've sent out to Ned Lynch to come and interrogate these guys. Lynch arrives, and he sees that one of them, of course, straight away he recognises them as Macpherson, the guy who had killed his dad. Now, according to Lynch, he was waiting, he went back to talk to other senior IRA officers, and he wanted to get permission to hold a court-martial to have this guy executed. That's Lynch's account. And what happens in the meantime is, while Lynch may not have been doing that. He may just have said, right, we need some guns for the firing squad. There might not have been a trial planned, because again, this guy had murdered Lynch's father. And what happens is that Macpherson and Robertson are separated. They're now more suspicious of them because Lynch has identified Macpherson. And Macpherson disappears. He escapes from IRA custody in Connolly, manages to get back to his British Army unit, and then leads them out towards Connolly. When the IRA realise that Macpherson is gone, they panic and they execute Private Robertson, who is the second soldier still being held. Word recording that Lynch is such a nice guy, he doesn't make any attempt to have Robertson escape with him. When Macpherson arrives back in the houses he has been held in, he'd walk into a house with a group of British soldiers in a search party, and he'd say, "I was held prisoner here last night or the night before." And of course, the people in the house would play innocent. "No, you weren't. We've never seen you." And then Macpherson would say, "Oh yeah, turn over that table." And they'd turn it over, and he had his initials and the date carved into the furniture. He either had a little, some accounts say a little tobacco knife, or he had a little Jaws harp instrument, and he was marking tables and chairs, outhouses, and he was remembered where all these places were. He had been gathering intelligence. He was able to bring the British to the houses, and some of them again were burned. Of course, as I mentioned, what happened to Private Robertson is that the IRA, before Macpherson arrived back with the search parties, the IRA took out Private George Robertson and they executed him. And they buried him in what at the time was called Colonel Tottenham's Bog, what today is known as Ballyknoe Bog. And as Ned Lynch says here in his statement, the other soldier was shot and buried in a bog in Connolly where the body still lies. That was 1952, but the body is still missing. That's a house near the location of where he was buried. And there is actually, or there was, I think it's gone now, but there was a small marker just marking the site of where Robertson had been, roughly the area where he was killed. Another similar event which happens is the disappearance of Private George Duff Chalmers. This happens in June of 1921. And some of you might have seen, I did again an RTE documentary about it. There was also, a Clare FM documentary. There was on the radio, there was also an RTE TV documentary, and this is a still from it. What happens in that incident is hard to work out because there's so many differing accounts, but this is the official IRA version. and this is the report that's sent to Richard Mulcahy in Dublin, who's the head of the IRA. And it says, quote, "A private of the Royal Scots dropped off a passing lorry, a lorry passing through C Company area. He was captured by 2 riflemen after a chase. The battalion staff, being satisfied that his object was to seek information, had him executed. He did not give information of any importance." And the execution was ordered by these 2 IRA officers, Stephen Gallagher and Seamus Hennessy. Now, was he the IRA? So basically, are claiming he was a spy. But you have to look at this in context of Royal Scots soldiers responsible for the Renine ambush, responsible for a number of killings, and a different group of Scottish soldiers responsible for the Milltown massacre. Scottish soldiers have a very bad name in the area. The last time the IRA had taken Scottish soldiers prisoner, it was Macpherson and Robertson, and look at how that had turned out. So basically, they're suspicious of the guy. There's a very strong oral tradition that Private Robertson was going to meet a local girl he was courting. That may have been the case. It's hard to work out what he was doing in that particular area. The British lorry he was with was serving a summons on a family called Tuttle, and he basically seems to have jumped down off the lorry, said good luck to his comrades, and said, I'll meet you later. And he goes wandering through the countryside. Now, if he's going to meet the local girl, it appears he's walking in the wrong direction. There's all sorts of questions about this. He should have known how dangerous and foolhardy this was. Now, the guy is only 18. He mightn't be that streetwise, but he was wounded in the Monrail ambush just a few months before, and that's only a short distance away. So again, it's a really foolhardy thing to do. The IRA, regardless, execute him, and he was buried in, I think it's Illanbawn or Drumbawn, that area. I'm sure, again, you're familiar with the story. He refused to give his name when he was interrogated and executed. I don't think he said anything to them. And there's all these, you'll hear fantastic stories again that, he was begging and crying for his mother. His mother was dead. He was an orphan. So again, you have to treat some of these stories with caution. Nobody knew the soldier's name. I wrote to the 1st Battalion of the Royal Scots Regiment, to their museum, and suffice it to say they had absolutely no interest in this soldier or where he was buried, didn't care about it whatsoever. I'm very sorry I didn't keep the letter they sent me, because it embarrasses to them, really. In 2012, I was doing my PhD. I discovered a list of missing British soldiers in Ireland, and one of them was listed as Private George Chalmers, who went missing in the Ennistimon area on the 11th of June 1921. And that was the same date as the IRA report that I had about a British soldier being captured and executed as a spy. So the name came out. In fairness, there had always been local people who marked the grave and who treated it with respect and looked after it. And I was talking to one of them, and we decided it had always been marked by a very simple wooden cross. And when I was shown the site and I talked to some local people, we decided that now that the soldier had a name, we should put a stone or something down and make it a proper grave. Not as a memorial to this guy, not to commemorate him or to honour him, because, I mean, he had no right to be in Ireland more than any other British soldier, but because it's obviously the decent thing to do to give anyone, regardless of who they are, a formal burial. So there was a stone put on the grave. That's a much younger, much slimmer me. And Cormac O'Corey is a great Connemara historian who was helping me do it, and there were 2 other local men who were involved. That was the grave at the time. I published this story in History Ireland magazine in 2012, thought no more about it, and then in 2018, the Chalmers family, this is Peter Chalmers, who would be, I think, a great-grandnephew of George Duff Chalmers, who was executed. They got interested in it, they got the authorities involved, and Private Chalmers' body was dug up 98 years later and formally reburied in, what's the name of the ceremony in Dublin? Grange Gorman Military Cemetery in Dublin. Very interesting as well that when Private Chalmers' body or remains were found, there was very little, obviously, after 100 years. They found basically the uniform, they found his cap badge, they found money in his pockets. The men who executed him, despite British propaganda at the time, they weren't thieves, they weren't robbers. They were doing this because they believed in a cause. And they did not rob this man. And it's very interesting, in another case, you have Patrick Joyce, who was an informer for the British. He was a school teacher in Galway. When his skeleton was found, he had money still in his pockets and a silver pocket watch, which would have been very valuable. So I think that's always a point worth emphasising. Of course, that hit the media headlines. That's from the Clare Champion, British soldier's body exhumed after 97 years. A massive security operation to, I don't know what the authorities thought was happening, but it was, I'd say, as large a security operation early as something you'd see for Donald Trump. When he comes to Clare, there was huge areas cordoned off, and not just myself, but I think other local people who've been involved were kept as far away from this as possible. That was the scene in Dublin, and again, there were myself and at least 1-2 other local people went up to it, and that is his headstone just there, and he had a small, respectful funeral. There was no Union flag waving, there was no playing of God Save the King or whatever. It was very much a family-driven event. And to come on to the last story, because I'm coming up on 40 minutes now, and I said I'd finish at about 45. Captain Christopher McCarthy, this is him here, from Cuid. As I said, you'd all know McCarthy's pub, that was his home place. He had a falling out with, I'm not sure if that's a 4th Battalion, the local area we're in now, but he had some kind of falling out, it appears, with the local officers. He was also dating a woman from 6 Mile Bridge. Now, I'm not sure is that before or after he went to East Clare, but either way, he transfers over to the South East Clare area where Michael Brennan had a very active flying column, probably the most successful one in County Clare. And on the 15th of June, 1921, the IRA attempted to raid mail from a train that was passing from Limerick up to Ennis. Despite, again, what you would hear the likes or what you used to read from Kevin Myers and Owen Harris. They no longer write in national newspapers. They used to have a lot of stuff about, the IRA murdered anyone they didn't like and called them a spy. The IRA went out and did things like took mail off of trains and censored it. They didn't just shoot you in most cases willy-nilly. They tried, there was a process to look for evidence. One of these raids on a mail train was organised. There were British soldiers on board the train. To cut a long story short, they surprised the IRA. The IRA had attempted to make a roadblock, stop the train. The train drove straight on through it. Most of the IRA, raiders basically were leaving the scene of the ambush, and these 2 men and a few others stayed behind, Captain Michael Gleeson and Captain Christopher McCarthy, and their job was to cut the telegraph wires, because they knew that when the train got to the next station, this might be reported and British troops would come flooding into the area. So they were trying to cut the communications. What happened was the train went on to Cratloe station. The British officer on board from the Royal Scots Regiment, who we're talking about a lot this evening, basically forced all the civilians off the train, told the driver to back the train downhill. And basically they were able to turn off the steam. The train is coming gliding back with British soldiers on board. Christopher McCarthy is up trying to cut the telegraph wires, and next thing the train reappears and British soldiers start jumping off it with machine guns. In fairness again to the train driver, again a trade unionist, he had been blowing the whistle trying to warn the volunteers that the British were coming back, and the captain of the British officers climbed on board into the driver's carriage and basically put the gun to his head and said, blow that whistle again and I'll blow your brains out. So the British surprised the IRA men who were still at the ambush site. Captain Christopher McCarthy runs from the telegraph wires up a hill in retreat under machine gun fire, and he's wounded. Then a local man, Captain Michael Gleeson, comes down, and if you know the Gleeson family, they're huge, built like rugby players, well over 6 foot. He comes down and he picks up Christopher McCarthy, puts him over his shoulder, and and starts running up the hill. He then gets hit by machine gun fire and drops McCarthy. And the British are advancing at the time. Gleeson is very badly wounded. He can't stand up. The British come up and they basically execute him on the spot. They find McCarthy crawling away, and basically one of the men who handled the body afterwards, some civilians were rounded up. They said that his throat had been cut out with bayonets. And it's very interesting that the local IRA flying column leader, Michael Brennan, was quite slim with fair hair, looked a lot like Christopher McCarthy. When the British soldiers took McCarthy's body onto the train, they were celebrating. They mistook McCarthy for Michael Brennan, the local IRA leader. And when they arrived in Ennis, McCarthy's body was thrown out onto the platform, and the British officer in charge, I think Lieutenant or Captain Gordon, kicked his body up and down the platform saying, "I've killed Michael Brennan," and celebrating. Of course, they hadn't killed Brennan. This is a memorial we put up in Léacht to mark the 90th anniversary, and you've relatives there, Christy McCarthy, of course, from Cuid, and Gleeson. And again, you can see what I said about the Gleesons, like I'm 6'1", and I'm looking up at these guys. They're very solidly built. And that is a local monument we have at Brennan's Cross in Léacht to basically all the dead of the East Clare Brigade of the IRA. And again, you can see Captain Christopher McCarthy is named on it. So to conclude, to follow up, just to wrap this up now, because I'm just about at 45 minutes. What happened in the end of the War of Independence, July of 1921, a truce happens, and some people would argue that it was a military stalemate. I would argue that it was certainly a stalemate. The IRA were in difficulty in Dublin, but doing very well in some regional areas. But that's something historians can argue about for years. Basically, to talk about County Clare, you're talking about the IRA in total across the county had captured 3 RIC barracks. They had burnt 28 others, and 26 had been demolished or destroyed, basically taken apart with crowbars or that kind of thing. And another 44 barracks had been evacuated. So the British had effectively withdrawn from the smaller towns and villages and left that territory to the IRA. They would only venture out into the countryside in force in very large armoured groups. This is a staged propaganda photo, it's not actual fighting. The IRA obviously could see them coming from miles away, but couldn't attack or hit big groups of this size. They didn't have the armament. The number of killed, you have 56 fatalities, about that in Clare. I might have to revise this, but per head of population, it was the fourth most bloody county in Ireland during the War of Independence. 56 British killed in Clare. Some of those are suicides. One of them is murder by another serving member of the British forces. We're talking about 41 of them killed by the IRA. By comparison, you've 21 Republican fatalities in Clare. 16 killed by the British forces, 9 killed in reprisals or while prisoners, 7 actually killed in fighting, killed in action, 3 die in active service, that can be catching pneumonia or so on, while they're out in the flying column, and 2 on accidental shootings. So to wrap up, the very last thing, why does any of this matter 100 years later? Can anyone recognise this guy in the photograph? Household name. You all had the book when you were kids. Dan Breen. Okay, later Fianna Fáil TD. This is his book, My Fight for Irish Freedom. And the language is, I think, Urdu. It's Indian. Dan Breen's story was known throughout the world. Terence McSweeney's name was known throughout the world. Because basically people who were fighting colonialism and oppression all over the world looked at what had been done in Ireland as a model. Historians on a global scale often talk about phases of the British Empire. And they say that the American Revolution in 1776 was key to the collapse of the first British Empire, and that Ireland in 1916 is key to the collapse of the second British Empire. Very different reasons for those. Of course, it's not native people who are fighting in America, and it's more about a principle of taxation, but we'll go into that another time. What you have here is Friends of Freedom for India marching in the St. Patrick's Day Parade in New York alongside the Irish who are demanding independence. This is the British Empire at the start of the First World War, covered three-quarters of the Earth's it covered a quarter of the Earth's surface and a third of the Earth's population. So the revolution that happened here inspired anti-colonial struggles in Africa, in India, the Middle East, in Vietnam, as well as places in Europe. I mean, you're talking about, in Spain, the Basque Country, the Catalans, and even in the Soviet Union. Lenin talked about the 1916 Rising and the Citizen Army in Dublin as being the first Red Army in Europe. This is a guy called Surya Sen. In the 1920s and 1930s, as we had shown, Breen's book was translated into Indian languages. Sen was leader of the IRA, the Indian Republican Army. Where did they get that title? He organised the other Easter Rising, which is on the 18th of April, Easter 1930. He leads a rebellion in India. We all know about Gandhi and the guys who tried to do it by peaceful resistance. He takes over a police barracks. He raises the new Indian flag, coincidentally green, white and orange, and he proclaims a provisional government. What's he copying? He's copying the 1916 Rising. And when these guys, these dead rebels, are captured and shot, there's quotes from Patrick Pearse and James Connolly in their pockets. He is hanged by the British in January of 1934, but again will be a household name, a national hero in India. The Freedom Charter of the African National Congress. This is Kader Asmal, who lived for many years in Ireland, and he said that the Freedom Charter was inspired in part by the 1916 proclamation. What's happening today in the era of Black Lives Matter? You're talking about people fighting to address the revisionist history of colonialism around the world. In Canada, in Brazil, in Australia, and even in England, people staring down statues to people who have been responsible for horrendous crimes in the name of British imperialism. What are we doing in Ireland? Well, we want to commemorate them. We all remember just before COVID, there was the RIC commemoration planned by Charlie Flanagan of Fine Gael. Backlash from, I think, 85% of the population is what came out in the exit poll for the general election. Important to say, though, there were people in Fine Gael who opposed this and were deeply embarrassed by it. And Fianna Fáil were involved in commemorating the RIC as well. There is a memorial, that's it in Dublin. That's the national memorial commemorating all dead members of the Royal Irish Constabulary and Dublin Metropolitan Police, unveiled by Brian Cowan in 2010. That's where Charlie Flanagan wanted to have his RIC commemoration ceremony. And that monument to the Black and Tans is still standing in Dublin today. So again, history is never that straightforward. You have to dig into it. This is Glasnevin Cemetery. This is the monument to all of those killed in the Easter Rising, including the British soldiers that helped suppress the rebellion and carried out things like the North King Street massacre. You'll notice that the people putting up the monument had so much respect and interest in the Irish language that they misspelt the word Irie. And that, of course, has been resisted as well, and there's a question of whether that project is going to continue, because if it did, it would be commemorating all of the Black and Tans and British soldiers and RIC men killed in the War of Independence. So those are two books that I wrote on County Clare. I don't have either of them here with me on sale tonight, but I'm sure if you're interested in them, you'll have gotten a copy by now. I am giving a talk. This is my most recent book on the truce of July 1921, which ended the War of Independence. I'm not sure if there's admission charge or not, but I'll be giving a talk in Oakwood Hotel in Shannon on that this Wednesday. If anyone's interested, I'll be talking actually about Ned Lynch and an escapade he was involved in on RTE Radio on the Miles Dungan History Show tomorrow at 6. I do have some of these. These are the local booklets that we produced in Meelick when we were putting up those monuments. If anyone wants one afterwards, I have them on sale here. So Shine, Anisha Guve, Mila Mahagav. Hope you enjoyed it.
So now we're inviting any questions from the people. Phádraig will be delighted to answer. Thank you.
Yeah, in the front row.
My family were involved in the War of Independence in Liverpool. They were, my father's people were, my father as a youth was involved in an anti-recruiting campaign that took place in Liverpool, where they would single out where black and tans lived, and they would commit acts of arson, empty the houses. And so I was brought up with the War of Independence on the bookshelves and in stories. There's a marvellous story about Easter week in one of the books that came out 50 years after commemoration of the Rising, where a handful of volunteers crossed over from Liverpool over to the North Wall, and they got on the bus and they asked for 6 singles to the revolution. But my main interest over the last 40-odd years, 50 years, has been in the songs. Not in the national songs, the nationally produced songs that appeared in, say, Terry Moylan's book, but in local songs. And I have been staggered to learn of how many songs were made in different areas on incidents within that happened during the War of Independence. Well, earlier than that anyway, the land wars and everything. One old singer told us in North Clare that if somebody farted in church, they made a song about it. And it's a source that I believe has been totally neglected. It really has. Some of these songs that we recorded in Clare, one in particular, has outlived the memory of the event itself. There is no evidence of the event happening, but it's called the Quilty Burning. And basically, a crowd of blokes, crowd of young lads, go along to the barracks and set fire to the barracks in Quilty. And then they stood on the corner at Quilty Cross, and they threw verses at each other. And a song survived, and that is the only evidence as far as I can find. And this, for me, is a massive resource. There are four songs about the Renine ambush. There are 2 songs. There's only one song survived in oral tradition, but there are 3 others that were locally made that we have in notebooks, so we've got from the newspapers. There are 2 songs about the Mac and Shanahan killing. And I really feel that these songs have to be got together. And this happened all over the country. You know, in every town where there was active in any way in the War of Independence, they made songs about it.
Absolutely, and an example of that would be we had a very small commemoration, just 15 people, for the centenary of Phádraig White, because that's all we were allowed at the time with COVID. And we said we'd read out the poem about Phádraig White, who was shot down in Clare. And then we had invited relatives, and they said, which poem are you going to read? We're like, there's 2 of them. And we've been researching this guy for 10 years, and the family had a total other one. And then we went down to Spike Island, where he had been killed by a British soldier, and then they had 2 other poems about him that had been written by the prisoners. And I mean, I thought I knew it all with one poem. So yeah, I'm undertaking other projects. It would be very worthwhile if somebody could gather up all the songs. You'll never get every single one, because there's numerous songs about the different ambushes. But I mean, what Terry Moylan has done is brilliant. I heard someone on the Miles Dungan history show again. I think they were actually based in Clare, who was performing some various songs in the War of Independence, which was great. And just on your earlier point, there's a fantastic book, perhaps you've read it, John Pinkman in the Legion of the Vanguard.
That's on that period that my father was involved
he was in the Liverpool IRA, and in fact I did a book about the British men who fought in the IRA in Ireland during the War of Independence. Now, not second generation Irish, I'm talking about English and Scottish guys coming over and actually joining the IRA. And for example, Arthur Wicks was an English trade unionist and socialist, an English Protestant who came over, no family connection to Ireland. He just heard through kind of socialist circles that James Connolly was up to something in Dublin, and he said, if there's a revolution on, I'm in it. And he was fatally wounded in the GPO in 1916. And you're talking about an Englishman in with the rebels inside the GPO, an English Protestant fighting for the Irish Republic, while Irish men like Michael Lean were in British uniform outside in the street shooting in at him and getting killed. So thanks for that. Any other questions? Hang on, they're bringing you the mic.
Don't we take this off?
No, you don't go and take it off, yeah.
Did the owners of the buildings burned receive compensation from the British government?
Did
they receive compensation?
If you had a building burned, could you receive compensation?
Yeah.
Depends who burnt it. The British, you see, that's a very complicated question. There were local assizes and local judges could award, let's say, if your building had been burnt by the British, depending on the judge, you might have been able to apply for compensation locally. The British government themselves set up a commission. There was two of them. There was the Compensation Commission for Ireland, and there was one for the support of loyalists. But basically, to apply for funding from them, it had to be the IRA who burnt your home, and you had to be able to prove that it was burned because you were loyal to the British Crown. And one very interesting thing about that is that the British barred, at the end of that process, there's a letter in the archives in London, and it's the people in charge of that compensation scheme barring any more applications from Léacht and Ennistimon, because everyone was writing in, even if they had never owned a house, saying their house was burnt. One woman wrote in, and I don't remember her name, but she just literally, it was a one-line letter, and it said, "Dear sir, will you please give me some of the money you are sending out? I am a most deserving cause." I think she may have said, "Send me some of the lovely money," or something you're sending out. So yeah, there was compensation for some people. You could get, there was a Republican group called the White Cross, who would give compensation to families who had suffered being burnt by the British. They didn't have a lot of money, obviously. You also had things like the Irish Volunteers Dependence Fund. So if your husband or your son was in prison because he had been locked up by the British, your family could get some money to keep you going until he was kept out. As far as I'm aware, there was no compensation for if you were a Republican woman and you were locked up. I've never heard of a Cumann na mBan Dependence Fund, but that just may reflect the sexism of the age.
So I was just wondering, where did they stay when they were in this locality, the Scottish regiment and the English, and who fed them? Where did they get the food from?
Well, in terms of Milltown Malbay, right up the edge of town, I think your Bank of Ireland has just closed, has it? Yeah, right across the way from that, I think it's a garage today. That was garrisoned by the Royal Scots, and Clare Library have photographs of the Royal Scots in there. The town hall in Milltown, where was that?
Here.
That was here. They were here, so that's another place. And then you had an RIC station in Milltown where the RIC Black and Tans would have been, and possibly some British soldiers as well. They were in the workhouse in Ennistimon and Léacht. I think the Royal Scots were all over Clare and Limerick. And if they didn't have a barracks locally, they would simply go in and take over a mansion or a large building or a hospital. And I mean, there's numerous accounts of British loyalists and landlords being kicked out of their home in the Revolution, not by the IRA, but by the British, who just go, "We're taking this over as a barracks, get out." And that's one of the reasons why these houses are burnt. People often think it's, because they didn't like landlords or it was about land. Sometimes it was for military and strategic purposes. So that's where they were based. Did you have a second part to that
The
question?
food, I wonder, had they somebody cooking for them?
Oh, the food. There was a boycott after the massacre at Canada Cross. There was a boycott of the RIC. RIC men could not walk into a local shop and buy food or supplies for the barracks. The same, I imagine, would have existed to a certain degree for the soldiers after Rennes. But the reality is, an army marches on its stomach. The British government is going to be supplying their food. It's going to be shipped into the barracks. Soldiers could go out and get local supplies. And even if you're the barman or the woman who owns the shop and you say, I'm not serving you, you're a bunch of murderers, they'll just pull out a gun and take what they want without paying for it. So it's hard to enforce these boycotts. You also have locals who are loyal to the British, who are selling them fruit and veg and things to supplement their diet. There's records of that happening as well. Harry, yeah.
You've done a lot of research, Phádraig. Have you ever, what level of support was there for the IRA in Clare? Have you come across much evidence of it? Because, for example, you mentioned there about the Brits getting food, and I mean, for example, the soldiers appear to have been able to drink in pubs in nearly every town in Clare. I mean, in Scariff, Broadford, O'Brien's Bridge, in fact there were shot-leaving pubs, in Ennis, in Milltown, and indeed in Ennis Diamond as well. They seem to be able to go in and be served in pubs, both the RIC and the British. So what, I mean, I know you could be forgiven for thinking afterwards that the whole country was in support of the IRA, but have you come across much evidence of what the reality was at the time, the level of support?
It's hard to put a definite figure on it. The best example we have is the election results, because be it the 1917 East Clare by-election, when De Valera wins, we have to remember at that time, in 1917, very few people could actually vote. I think you had to be a man of 30 who owned your own house before you could vote. In 1918, that changes, and what you see now, De Valera, of course, wins that election. But in 1918, the vote is widened, and it's notable that younger people and women, when they vote, seem to be very supportive. And in something like the May 1921 local elections, again, Sinn Féin sweeps the boards really in the south. We shouldn't just look at it as support for the Sinn Féin party. People like Countess Markovich and I can never remember his name, but the Sinn Féin TD for Wexford were both also members of the Labour Party and the Labour movement. I don't think it was a formal party at that stage, but people supported things like the Irish language movement and supported things like trade unionism, which also fed in, but you might see that reflected at the polls. So there was very popular support in areas like Clare. You also had, though, throughout Clare and throughout Ireland, you had loyalists. And loyalist doesn't mean Protestant Orangeman. Loyal just simply means loyal to the British Crown. And you have people whose families had served in the British Army in the First World War or in the Royal Irish Constabulary, or people who just thought that, you know, the King of England, the Empire, that's a great idea. Let's keep on board with that. So there is small little pockets of support. Mostly these people are easily identified and they keep their heads down in areas like County Clare. They might give information to the British secretly. But in other areas, like in Cork City, you'd have a lot of very kind of vocal support for the British as well amongst some sections. In terms of, I don't think the pub boycott is an accurate measure of, you know, how popular they were, because no matter how much I disliked someone, if they came up and, you know, forced me to do something at gunpoint, I don't think I'd be, you know, principled enough to say no, I'm not. I think there is, in that if the British soldiers, you know, if they couldn't get served what they wanted, they would just take at gunpoint. I mean, it's what they had done in Africa and all over the world. It's no different here. And it's very interesting as well that you could get attacks on pubs. Like there was a Scottish soldier, Sergeant Rowe, killed when the IRA did a grenade attack on Shotnessy's pub in the market in Ennis. But it's long story short, it's hard to work out exactly how much support they had. The IRA, of course, could not have operated without, people to give them information, without civilian support, houses to stay in, people to feed them, because they didn't have Michael Collins and Richard Mulcahy sending them down food and, supplies and things. It was the local people who supported them. And I suppose the best indication of support is the election results, but it's not a perfect indication due to how elections were run at the time. Yes, sir. Yeah.
You mentioned that attack on Shaughness's pub in Ennis. In Joe Power's book, he attributes the reason for the attack to Phádraig O'Loughlin, who was the vice commandant of the Mid-Clare Brigade. But that is incorrect. He quotes from a witness statement, and he attributes the witness statement to Phádraig O'Loughlin as well. But Phádraig O'Loughlin died in 1922, and the witness statement was made in 1954.
Different Phádraig O'Loughlin.
Peter O'Loughlin from Ennis.
Yeah, one of the guys who was interviewed by Ernie O'Malley for that book, I think, took part in it. He was it Paddy Con McMahon? He was a dance hall owner in Ennis. I think he was involved. It's confusing when you have two guys with a similar name. And the other thing that historians do, and look, I've done it myself on things like I had elements, like I said that William Shanahan was there and was one of the people who shot Lendrum when William Shanahan wasn't there when the actual car was ambushed. And what you do as a historian is people bring out new evidence, and if somebody can bring documents or reliable information and just say you got it wrong, it doesn't matter that you have a PhD or whatever. The best thing you can do is just put your hands up and go, sorry, fucked up, got it wrong. And if you're lucky enough to have a second edition of the book, you can try and correct it. But I've often confused the two men, I'd say, myself. I don't know if I've done it in my books, perhaps I have, and if I have done that to anyone's relative, I apologise. But when you have a Phádraig O'Loughlin and a Peter O'Loughlin and they're so similar, it's easy to see how the mistake would be made. Oh, we one here, yeah.
Pull us down. Yeah, no, I was want to ask you, Hampson, who obviously was Hampson, who was part of the massacre at Canada Cross. From what I know, he got to live out his life. He ended up in the middle of the country, I think. I was just wondering, do you have any more information on what maybe he got up to after that? Was there any more? Because I understand that he was a bit of an alcoholic and he was a bit of a mess. He was a bit of a mess up, really. But do you know any more of what became of him after the Canada Cross?
I'm afraid I don't. I haven't followed him. I know that a lot of the RIC family, the RIC men and the families, moved out of the area after some of the more controversial incidents that they requested transfers and things. And basically no one in the town often, except for, again, some very diehard loyalists, would talk to these people. I can't say that I followed Hampson and what happened after him. Personally, when I wrote on Clare, I just focused on him and his time in Clare and in that incident. Personally, I'd be far more interested in what happened to MacDonald, the RIC guy who gets up and says, all these guys are lying. Those people were massacred. Yeah. And I think it's people like that, in fact, and the monument here in East Clare, where's it now if I can bring it up? The last name of that, Thomas Healy. Healy was a Kerryman who was in the RIC, and he had a family and a pension to think about, and he just decided what was being done was wrong. And he started giving ammunition to the IRA. When he came under suspicion of that, he was based in Ennis, he defected, he joined the East Clare Brigade of the IRA, and he was killed in action. And the new state even tried to deny his family a pension because he had died of a heart attack during an ambush and because he hadn't been shot by a bullet. So to me, like, if I was writing a book, like, I'm not interested in focusing on some really horrible You know, a guy like Hampson, I'm far more interested in somebody like MacDonald or Healy who stood up and who did the right thing, even when it cost them their pension, it risked them and their families' lives. So the short answer is no, I can't tell you anything more about the guy. But if you're not, it sounds like you're researching that already. I'd encourage you to dig into it, and you can educate me.
If you don't mind, I might give some information on that. There has been some other research on it, and Sergeant Hampson came to Milton as a demoted RIC officer because of his alcoholism. But he was transferred fairly quickly out of Milton after the trial, or at least the judgment failing, and he became a trainer of black and tan arrivals in guerrilla warfare somewhere up the Midlands. But I suppose in the ultimate kind of irony of our history, a descendant of Sergeant Hampson's actually ended up as the president of one of our great colleges in Dublin, Blackrock College. And another research has discovered that a further descendant, up to recently, was the parish priest of a parish in County Dublin called in Lusk Parish. So, you know, it's our history. If you don't mind, just a little bit about Thomas O'Leary, who died in the shootings here. He had survived a very infamous event, I suppose, a few years before that, called the landing in Souvla Bay. And the irony of it is that he, father of 10, he came to Milltown to die in a totally unprovoked shooting. John O'Loughlin from the Ennistimon Road, his brother had died 2 years before that, fighting in the Great War. And I suppose in our family, a brother-in-law of my grandfather, Pat Hennessy, fought in the Second World War when he immigrated to England and died sometime after from wounds he received in that. But the story of Sergeant Hampson is kind of a microcosm of our history as well. But there you are, just a bit of information. I think...
Michael, could I just ask, maybe Cyril Jones has very kindly given us that material for exhibition tonight, which is from his own premises. So I wonder, could Cyril maybe just say a few words about that?
I think most of the stuff has already been covered. The only thing I brought in there was a bit of a souvenir. It's a leaf from a table that was rescued from the fire before it took hold. And one of the leaves has a bullet hole which had been fired in through the window before they threw in the petrol and ignited the house. So I think that's about all I can.
Yeah, very good. No, it's amazing to see. The first thing that hit me coming in the door was the glass gun, and I knew straight away the shot at malt. That's what it was, and I've never seen one. I've only ever heard it described. So to me, that was amazing. And I've often thought like it'd be amazing to go out to Charles Lynch's home. The Lynch family, of course, are still there, and I'd love to actually excavate as an archaeologist and see, could you find the pieces of glass from the original, but of course they're long since swept away. But that to me is fascinating, and again to see the bullet holes. And I think Irucht, I'm not sure they would Irucht and Clore now, but the old doors of Marinan's pub used to have the bullet holes as well. I mean, things like that are fascinating, they're priceless. Thanks for bringing it.
The only thing at the moment is Lucozade is in the gun now instead of the...
Very good, yeah. You never know. Alexander McPherson might have been partial to Lucozade, although given that he was Scottish, it was probably more likely Ireland brew he'd have been drinking.
This is a leaf from the top of the table that was salvaged from Jones's premises the night of the burning. Years later, Teddy Hogan, a local carpenter, cut out this section here and replaced it with a new bit of timber. This is the actual bullet hole where one of the bullets from the tens after passing through the window, it went through the table. The story of Ned Lynch's encounter with the tens, and this is the actual, or at least it looks like the replica of the shot of malt that a lot of the public houses sold at the time. So they fill that with brandy or rum or whatever liquor of their choice for the way home after a night in the town. So it gave a bit of a boost to their step.
Oh, I didn't recognise you with the mask.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Would you have any information on Captain, or he was Captain Roach? He was involved in the in England with Ned when they went into the Chelsea barracks and for the guns. He was court-martialed. I think he served a term in prison in England, and I mean he sacrificed a lot for the cause. At that time, he was a family man.
He got 6 months. The incident you're talking about, Charlie, would be, what would you be a nephew, is it, of Ned Lynch that's mentioned there? Or?
He was my uncle.
Your uncle, yes. And you'd be what, Charles Lynch that was killed, he'd be your
grandfather.
Grandfather, yeah. And I interviewed you for I didn't recognise you there with the mask. I could recognise some other people. The incident you're talking about, Ned Lynch goes to, he's sent over to London, this man here, during the truce, by Michael Brennan, who's then leader of the IRA throughout all of Clare. And he's told to go over and to buy guns. And he's given £100. He's told that there's £1,000 coming. Problem is, if you've seen TV shows like the Peaky Blinders, you'll realise every Republican who wasn't busy in Ireland had been sent to London to buy guns in the black market. Every anarchist and socialist and communist was there on the same job. So guns weren't to be had. They only managed to get 2 revolvers. And they were on the way home and they were introduced to, it was in the King's Head pub in the West End. It's not there anymore, sadly. I checked it out the other night. It's actually a Lebanese restaurant now. But they were in the King's Head pub and they were introduced by a guy called, I think it's I'm not sure, is it Tolan or something. They were introduced to a guy called Sergeant Roach and another British soldier, Sergeant Reynolds. And when they were told what they were after a few drinks, Ned Lynch says in his witness statement that Sergeant Roach would have given us the entire barracks if we wanted it. This guy Roach was a machine gun instructor with the Irish Guards. He was on loan to a Welsh regiment in the Welsh Fusiliers in Chelsea barracks, and he basically said to the IRA lads, come with me. They rented a taxi, went down to Chelsea barracks and came out of it with 2 Lewis machine guns. The IRA in Clare had never captured one of these in the war. Suddenly there was 2 of them and a number of rifles. Not content with that, a few nights later they got another taxi. They went to Windsor barracks, which is where Sergeant Roach was stationed, and they took 4 Vickers machine guns and another 20 rifles. And of course the peace talks were going on at the time. This is after the ceasefire has begun. This is in November of 1921, and it nearly collapsed, the whole peace negotiations, 3 weeks before the treaty is signed. What happened to them is Sergeant Roach was arrested on the train. He was interrogated by Scotland Yard. I found the name of the detective who interrogated him was a guy called Kitchener, Ralph Kitchener. He wrote a biography and he mentions interrogating Roach in it. I can't get the book, but I'm looking for it. But what happened to Roach was he broke. He turned King's evidence, so he gave information. But Lynch, in fairness to him in his statement, says you have to forgive the guy. I mean, he had a wife, he had young kids. Lynch didn't hold it against him for turning. And Roach got a reduced sentence because of his service during the First World War. He got 6 months. The other guys who were picked up, Michael Hogan, who was over there, got a year. Charles Lynch escaped because when they did arrests in London, they arrested a Thomas Lynch who had the misfortune, wrong place, the wrong time, to be an Irishman who was sharing the same accommodation as Hogan and the others. And when they said to Roach who's involved, we said Lynch. They went, oh yeah, we picked him up. They never caught Ned Lynch, who was the one guy who managed to make it back to Ireland. And I'm actually talking about that on Miles Dungan tomorrow night at 6 o'clock on RTE Radio. And I must drop up to you, I'll send you in the post a copy of the new research I've done on that incident. But that's what happens to Roach. 6 months in prison is what he got.
Well, he gave up a very cushy job.
He did.
Security to help the IRA, and I hope it was remembered, you know, even though, as you say, he turned King's evidence after.
Yeah.
But still, I think I'd feel that the man, he was a fairly genuine man, you know.
He, throughout the War of Independence, he had been giving the London battalion of the IRA guns, 1s and 2s, the whole time, and no one was missing them. I think drink got the better of them on the night, and we've all been drunk and ordered a taxi and done the wrong thing at some stage in our lives. But Roach definitely just, was taking anything he could get his hands on. Yeah, and definitely, I mean, he broke under interrogation later, but he tried to do the right thing initially.
There could be a film made out of that.
That's exactly what we say. Listen, RTE tomorrow, and I'll post you up the new stuff I have on it.
Okay, thanks.
No problem, thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, ladies.
Some of your own members. Some of your own members.
Thank you, Shane. No, first of all, great word of thanks to Dr. Phádraig for what was very informative, very instructive, and something to be very proud of. That wonderful descriptions he gave there. I'd like to, I suppose, on behalf of all, thank Seamus and OaC for putting this on, and of course our sound expert over here, Mr. O'Malley, and Master of Ceremonies and Director of the OaC for layman facilities in this great place. So thank you very much, and thank you all for coming as well.
Great stuff. There's one here. Go ahead. Thanks so much. Everything else okay? You did very well there. Seriously, man.
Thanks.
You sounded good, like.
Glad you.
I wouldn't be made into history, like, but well done. I thought your voice was good.